So, the artist Cecily Brown has an unsuccessful painting that she has kept on the wall of her studio for many years. It reminds her of how easy it is for an artist to overwork a painting. She calls it overcooked. This idea intrigued me at the time, and it certainly came to mind last spring when I went through the fascinating exhibition at the Met Breuer called Unfinished. Unfinished and overcooked would seem to be the two dangers that an artist should avoid at all costs. But we know that's not true with the unfinished. A lot of work that was criticized as being unfinished has turned out to be revolutionary and truer to life. So I wonder, is there any upside to the overcooked? Are there things that artists can learn from going too far? Is it always a failure, like the most famous example in Balzac's powerful story of the unknown masterpiece, in which a great artist spends his last years working on a painting of a nude that he claims is going to be his culminating masterpiece? No one's allowed to see it in his studio until he's on the verge of death, and his admirers discover that his nude has disappeared behind a chaos of impacted brushstrokes. And as we know, Cocteau's definition of genius was knowing how far to go too far. Now, I saw Edmund Mars here. Edmund, the Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer of Theodore Roosevelt, also Ronald Reagan, Ludwig von Beethoven, and now he's at work on Charles Edison, sent me an email on this subject. In music, he said, quote, Beethoven was the most compulsive reworker of them all. He used to bash away at his initial ideas until they were hammered into the best shape possible, and often something banal became something sublime. So what I'd like to do today is explore the overcooked idea with two contemporary artists whose work I admire very much. One of them, Julian Lethbridge, is an abstract painter. The other, Dana Schutz, is figurative, or maybe semi-figurative. Dana was born in Livonia, Michigan, a suburb of Detroit, in 2002, the same year she got her undergraduate degree from the Cleveland Institute of Art. She made her New York debut at the LFL Gallery, which became Zach Foyer, and her career has never faltered since then. She took a graduate degree at Columbia, and she now lives in the Gowanus section of Brooklyn with her sculptor husband, Ryan Johnson, and their baby boy, Arlo, who just had his second birthday. She currently shows at the Petzl Gallery in New York. Her wildly colorful, inventive, and extremely influential paintings combine strong storytelling with surreal probings of the inner life. Her work is in the collections of the Met, not the Met. The Modern. Not yet. Yes, it should be. The Guggenheim, the Whitney, San Francisco MoMA, and on and on. Our other panelist, Julian Lethbridge, was a global artist before global art became the norm. Born in Sri Lanka to a British father and Austrian mother and raised by a Ceylonese nanny, he lived in Austria and Malta in addition to Ceylon before moving at the age of 8 to England, where he did his growing up. He wanted to be an artist, but he told me he, quote, didn't have the nerve not to go to Cambridge, close quote, where majoring in studio art didn't exist. Soon after graduation in 1969, he left for America, where he landed a banking job at Morgan. But the idea of being an artist never stopped nagging away at him. He got up his courage and quit his full-time job, worked part-time for the bank, and began his life as a painter. He's been showing his beautifully intricate and cerebral abstract paintings at the Paula Cooper Gallery since 1989. And he's in the collections of the Met, the Whitney, the Tate, the Art Institute of Chicago, National Gallery of Art in Washington, and so on. He works in New York City and also right here in Kent. So, ladies first. Dana, have you ever overcooked a painting?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, I think like last night.
You did last
possibly.
night. Well, you were
Yeah.
working in the studio till 3 in the morning, you told me.
Yeah. And I don't know if it worked out.
Well, could you tell us a little bit about this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's an interesting question because I think whenever there is a painting that is overcooked, you usually destroy it or throw it away or take it off the stretcher. So So it's usually the painting that's not really photographed. And I think all paintings usually go through some kind of adolescence where they're very awkward and then they come out in some way. But I think that there's, it's hard to describe exactly what it is. I think it's the surface, where the surface becomes so cakey and so terrible that you can't quite.
Encrusted.
Yeah, that you can't deal with it. But I don't know, but it's interesting though, because I think that there's been so much painting recently where it's almost about hiding a kind of work to it, or hiding its process maybe. That it's the idea of a painting that's been overtouched is possibly interesting and maybe tragic comic.
But the process, sort of getting at the process, revealing the process is an interesting subject to get into. So in other words, the overworked, you feel is exposing too much?
I think it's just somehow you see all the decisions and they only seem like this pile of decisions that are trying to cover up other decisions. Right. That because I think you can have paintings that have like a really intense surface and look like there's been struggle, but they somehow come out on the other end, and you stop seeing all the decisions, but you really can get into the picture, or the space of the picture, or the thing.
Because there's 1,000 decisions that go into every painting that are made. I mean, it's thousands of decisions. But Julian, how about you? Have you ever overcooked a painting?
Oh, I mean, I don't think there's any artist who hasn't had that experience of working too long on something. The problem with the metaphor is that if you say something's overcooked, it suggests there was a moment when it was cooked just right. And mostly in the paintings that reach some point where they're kind of beyond one's reach or beyond salvation, in my case, they probably were not ever at a point that was just right. Sometimes maybe you get to something which is resolved in some sense and pleasing, but then you have some instinct that to do this or try this or take it further, and you get to a point where you think, oh, damn it, you've lost something that was there, and you've gone too far to be able to bring it back. But I have really two thoughts. One is sometimes a painting that, from my point of view, has reached that point where it's gotten out of reach and sort of out of control because it's become too clogged or too labored. Right. In some instances, well, at that point you have two choices. You either destroy it or you put it to one side, or you make it worse by working on it longer, or you sort of give up your ambition for it and you think, well, now here's this thing that is not what I was meaning to do, and it's not going to work, so you can behave towards it with a more kind of reckless abandon. And that can sometimes lead to a place that you wouldn't have otherwise got to. In which case, the state you're talking about, the overcooked, becomes something you're grateful for. I think that if you hadn't reached this point, you wouldn't have just got to this.
To that point. Now, I'm going to ask if you could talk about a particular painting called Overmade.
I mean, I would say that's just a painting that illustrates what I've just said, that I think when I began it, I had something in mind that was much more looser and freer and a more direct path to what is there, to what is there now. And when that was lost, I mean, that's certainly a painting which I'd basically completely given up on. And I thought, well, there's nothing to lose, so I can be much more reckless and be more courageous with it than I would have been otherwise. Some artists are fearless in that way, that they have such confidence in everything they do that the sense of reaching some point where you can then do something that undoes it is not part of their experience. I'm not one of those people. So in this case, for me, sometimes that sort of fearless way of behaving where you risk losing something in order to get somewhere else, it's easier for me to reached that state of mind with a painting that I have lost some of my hopes and ambition for.
You mentioned the word risk. Risk is a really important word because you're taking risks all the time, and if you don't take the risks, I mean, risks lead to maybe overcooking, often overcooking. But does overcooking make it so that, I mean, the idea of taking a risk, does the fear of overcooking make it so that you're afraid to take the risk?
I don't know. I mean, the risk is if you have something that's precious to you, you risk losing it. I guess that's the risk. If it's not precious to you, that risk is diminished. And I think, I don't know about you, Dan, but I think some people, when they reach a point that is kind of satisfying, they become more cautious about how to proceed or how to resolve it. And I think that can be useful or it can be destructive. It's like, I mean, I never quite, angels rush in, when fools rush in where angels fear to tread.
Okay.
That balance about whether to proceed or whether to hold back is one of the multitude of decisions that you've both referred to, I guess, that is quasi-constant.
Dana, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, I think that at a certain point there's almost no choice where you just can't, if a painting sort of looks okay, but it's not right. It's what Julian was saying, at that point you have nothing to lose. You're just kind of like, well, like the painting I was working on last night. At a certain point I just smashed the whole thing up because it was, and I immediately felt this relief because I think what it was I was holding on to, I had such high hopes for it to go a certain way, and then I realized that was just, it was just gonna, it was going to be a bad painting no matter what.
Maybe bad isn't bad.
I mean, there's good bad and there's bad, but it was gonna be bad.
Okay.
But maybe that's the thing. Maybe it could be good bad now. I don't know. So that
Right.
I just did.
Well, so it's a good idea that you're in Kent today.
Yeah. So
Get
now I
away
don't know,
from
and maybe I'll see it and be like, oh no, that's.
You won't know, but
Maybe it's a good idea. Maybe Dana will get back to your studio and it'll look different to you and it'll look wonderful. And you'll feel,
maybe.
because I think that relates to the notion of unfinished. Because I don't think you can really think about something going too far if you don't think of not going far enough.
Yeah.
that's exactly right.
And I think one of the things that's interesting about the Met show is that, well, I'll back up. I suspect that if something's a really, really good painting, at any stage in its progress that you look at it, it looks like a really, really good painting. And I think that if a painting is not very good at some stage, it's going to be harder to turn it. It becomes harder to turn it into something very good.
Yeah.
So in a sense, if something is very, very good at any stage, then it's going to be always interesting to look at it. And part of the thing about the Met show is the ambiguity about whether something is left so-called unfinished because the artist died, because the phone rang and they left it, because Dana had to come up here to the thing.
Right.
And you come back and you look at it and you're a different person because you're fresher, you've done something different. And what you come back to look at is actually, what you're looking at is not the same thing as it was when you left it.
And you're not the same person
and
who
you're not
left
the
it.
same, but yeah, exactly.
Really interesting. Dana, I'm going to see if I can get an image of yours called Glider. So could you tell us about this? I mean, it was at a particular moment in your life. It was just after Arlo was born.
Yeah.
And
So
you struggled with this, you said.
yeah.
And you thought it may have been overcooked. Could you talk about why and what that was and how you came out on the other side of it?
Well, there was a moment where I felt like I pulled it together with just one kind of move at the end. So, but I think, what Julian was saying about like a good painting is always a good painting at all stages. That paintings go through different changes, but I think there's clarity. I think some paintings have clarity, and then some paintings you just can't quite get a clear picture on. You're kind of, and I think they're both interesting in different ways. Like sometimes a painting can be too clear, and then it just feels like this, feels kind of empty, and like it's, but then I think sometimes it can, if it's not clear, it can just feel like this lost pile where you're trying to cover it up and everything. But in this case, this is like right after my son, and like I wanted to make a painting that was about that experience of just being stuck in this chair, like breastfeeding, and also the pumps. Sorry, I don't know, it's just really abstract. It's like an abstract thing. So I think all my ideas for how I wanted this to be were kind of abstract. They weren't very clear thoughts. I was like, well, I want the body and the chair to be kind of one thing, and then I want everything to feel like a clock. But then in terms of the approach of how to paint it, I wasn't sure. And then there was also all these interruptions because I was having to pump.
Because you were having to pump.
So it was really kind of sick. So it was just like.
But sick turned out.
Well, I mean,
really?
I felt okay about the painting at the end because it was a different painting for me. I think I wouldn't have taken a picture of it if I didn't feel,
Right, like as Julian was saying,
like it
those
did
don't end up getting
somehow.
photographed.
And I guess I forgave certain things about it, like that it does have this clotted surface and all this stuff. And in person, there's like areas where it's more clotted and all this stuff. But in the end, there's like that paintbrush stroke on the leg that I put in. It's very small, and that just made the whole painting work for me. There's like that little white patch, or like that little yellow patch, because it kept things moving in a. Before that, it didn't have any direction.
Did it have anything to do with the fact that, I mean, you had done a painting about giving birth, but before you, that was years before. Here, this is something that was personal to you while it was going on for you. Were you too close to it?
I think I was way too close to it. I couldn't even see it as a clear subject. You know what I mean? Or even because it was just because it was happening at that same time or something. So I think it was
So
like
distance is good.
Well, I think distance can give clarity, and you can organize a picture. Like I feel like the birth painting that I had made before, and before I had ever had a child or anything, I could organize it. I could know what was going to be in it. Like there will be a bed, and then there's the thing happening, and then there's going to be this space on the top. Like I could organize it. But with this, it felt like there was the figure is part of the chair, and the back is the front. It was just like, and it felt like that. With time, I realized it felt like that experience at that time, where things were very compressed. And
Do you think that a lot of effort and work that goes into a painting makes a painting that is not a good thing for a painting? Too much work going into a painting?
No, I think sometimes it can work. I think sometimes it can come out. I do think that. I think sometimes the best paintings feel like they just happen, like you're just like, oh, this just happened,
But with every single painting that, as an artist, every single painting you attempt, it's got the chance of going off the rails. And so maybe I might ask Julian first, but I'd like to ask Dana too. How do you know when to stop? How do you know when to call it quits? How do you know when it's finished?
Well,
It's a different answer for you than it would be for Dana.
I don't know, it's that different. How do you know where to put another brushstroke? I mean, I think there's something that happens in the process where you just say, that's enough. It's like another decision. Sometimes you finish it by, as I sort of like what I was suggesting to Dana, it's finished by changing the mind that's looking at it. I mean, I think if you're working on a painting, one way you can alter it is by putting some paint somewhere different or putting some different brush strokes on it. Another way you can change it is to leave it alone. I mean, it's not a deliberate thing. You leave it alone. You work on something else or two things, and those works make you see something in the previous painting that resolves it, that wasn't there before. So now this painting is, from my point of view, finished in a way that it wasn't before. But it's finished because the eyes or the references or the way you're looking at it is has been changed by the existence of something that came out of it.
Is that the same for you? Do you feel?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think there's also the feeling that it stops speaking to you. Like it just all of a sudden stops asking for things, and it stops being irritating in different parts of you. It just
Stops surprising you?
no, it just stops talking to you. I feel like there's it's almost physical, like you can kind of feel
That's
it.
interesting.
Like when you want to, that there's something that needs to go there, or there's something that needs to happen there. But sometimes it can just sort of go whoop and like stop talking to you. And I think
It's like, again, in the Unfinished show, you have a sense with those Cézanne paintings that the paintings that people thought were unfinished because there was canvas on them. From his point of view, they weren't unfinished. They were just complete. And again, all these art historians, I hesitate to make any quotes, but somewhere in one of his letters or something, he's quoted as telling his wife, who was complaining that he could never, the reason he didn't sell any paintings was because he didn't finish them, and there was all this raw canvas on them. And I'm deferring to the others, explained that that the reason he left them and that they were finished was because if he added one more brushstroke, he'd have to repaint the entire painting. So in a sense, I don't know that he would have known ahead of time, before dealing with what it was in front of him, that at this stage it's resolved and he's content to let it be the way it is, where the negative unfinished space is as active as the part of the canvas that has paint on it, when there's some kind of balance there. And I mean, part of the mystery about making a painting is that I don't think you know those things until you do it and try it. You can't really think it through. And it's very hard to think. I don't know how. I mean, those Cézanne paintings at the Met show, I don't think that he could have intended to set out making that flower painting with all that empty space in it. It would have been something that he discovered in the doing of it, and that at that point it was enough. It was a kind of
Right.
and certainly other people's work. I mean, there is certain artists' work that I don't like because it becomes so labored all over, and you have a sense that they. I mean, I think I can be like that too. Sometimes it's like it comes too easily. It can't be real. It's too effortless. It's cheating. It doesn't have enough puritanical labor into it. But I think there are some artists who really take that to some point where everything has to be so worked that any life or air or space in it is gone. It's claustrophobically excluded. Yeah.
I think it's like almost like an ethical issue, or it just. Because I agree. I think that there's sometimes where it means something when you see that something has been really overwrought. It's a certain kind of artist who makes something that's really overwrought, And then also, I do think there's a tension in something that's almost there, and that it hangs there, and then the viewer comes in to either accept it or not, and I think maybe the artists themselves is the primary viewer. Like, if they can, like, it's a question of, can you tolerate this or something? Like, and then if you can, maybe.
If the artist can,
then maybe someone else can too, or something.
One of the things that's great about painting is that it encompasses the whole universe, the whole range of possibilities. I mean, there's work that one loves because it's so painful, and it feels it was such an effort, and it was such a. It was so dragged out of the artist with such pain and difficulty and distress. And yet you reach somewhere that you would not have gotten without that.
Without that, right.
And then there's work that you love because it's just happened like that. Mm-hmm. So, I don't think that you can, and I think the rules are different for all. That in the same way that the spectrum is almost sort of universal, that the rules at any moment across that spectrum are applied, are different rules.
Do you, for instance, Julian, ever have anybody, do you listen to anybody who might come into the studio? Has anybody ever said, this is overdone, or would you listen to that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I listen, if you let somebody see, I mean, I listen to anybody. And it's either, I mean, the main thing is it can be painful or useful or not useful. Or a pleasure. I mean, there's four possibilities for the range of things. But I think often it's somebody, particularly an informed person, somebody can see something in a painting that lets you see your own work differently, in the same way as They can do that about, I mean, that's what scholars and critics who are very gifted do about a whole range of work. And I think obviously somebody can do that too. Don't you agree? It does that to your own work, where they see something and you think, and then you try and look at it from that point of view. And if it's useful to you, you can use it. And if it isn't, you discard it. It's a kind of...
At this point where you are, say, with this painting that's been giving you trouble, 3 o'clock in the morning, would this be a moment where you'd let somebody come in and see it?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
I mean, well, my husband and anybody who's near it. Like, it's like this thing, I'm like, because I don't know if I can really see it right now. Like, I can't see it. It's not what I intended initially, but I think it's interesting. I think it's interesting, and for me it was a surprise, and so I think that's something that is important, or that and often it's kind of the hope. You always kind of want to in some way be surprised, because then I just think that
if you lose that,
it's something you can't kind of fake or something. It's just you can't anticipate it because it's a surprise.
Yeah, but maybe without the surprise, when you've lost the surprise, that might be a key that it's gone in a direction you don't like. If it doesn't do that to you, for you,
I think there's different degrees of it.
Yeah.
Like before, with this particular painting, it was just okay, and that wasn't good. So I think that was worse than, right. You can have, have a painting and it kind of works out and it's good, there's struggles within it, but it's ultimately feels like effortless, and I think that's not necessarily negative, but I think that it's just always you want, surprise is really rare and exciting.
It's very rare.
So I felt surprised, and that it was okay, despite it looking really muddy, the palette, but I liked what was happening, so I kept on trying to ask people who were near it, like my husband if he came to the studio, or a friend. And he liked it.
And that idea
my friend did not.
Oh, really?
But so now
you're in between.
But I like it.
Well, that's.
But she has a point. Sorry, so I don't know.
Well, it'll be interesting to see where that lands. I was also fascinated to hear Julian say that in other words, if you decide to go further with a painting, it meant that it wasn't right. It wasn't where you wanted it to be. So the idea of wishing that you could go back to where you were, which is you can't really do, is a wasted energy.
Well, one never knows that. I always think if you work more on something, it would be nice to, and you, from your point of view, mess it up. It would be nice to go back to that point before you did that, but then you don't know if at that point you would then leave it as it was, or if it just means you'd go off in a slightly different direction. And not make the mistakes that you made in the other.
That's true.
In the other instance. I mean, one of the things is that I think what you're trying to do is describe a state of mind that is sort of indescribable. It's that when a painter is working on something, they're doing it for the pleasure of it, or there's some motive at work that is sort of mysterious, and it's a mixture of pleasure and trying to get to something that doesn't have form until you get there and all of that. And in a way, some moment when you recognize, when you're at a point that answers all that motive, it's not a specific moment, and it's not a finite thing, and it's almost indescribable. It's confined to the moment and to the relationship of the maker and the work at that stage. And I think that too those moments can happen over a very wide range of. Right. I mean, the other thing that addresses your question is that I've often worked in series, partly out of that I think it's the way my mind works, and partly because I'll get a painting to a stage where I think, well, that's really a surprise, and it's really interesting to me, and I like it the way it is, and I'm happy to have it exist as it is. However, I want to do such and such to it, and that was my original plan. So in a sense, at that point, you can either lose the first thing, or you can proceed, or lose the second thing and stay where you are, stay in that same place. Not so much recently, but in the past, I've often resolve that to somewhat, not completely, by resolving to getting another painting the same stretcher, the same size, getting it to exactly the same place. It won't be exactly the same place, but something that comes close to the same place. And then choosing which is the one that's the better expression of that state, and then taking the other one further. And that's a little bit, I mean, the only thing that I can think that's like that in art making that you can't do in painting, basically, is printmaking, where then you can get an image to a point where it engages you, and you pull a proof of it. So there you have that state preserved. Now, if you go on working on the plate, you may not be able to make an edition of the thing before, but you at least have all this. You have the different states in that stage to compare and examine and see what you learn from those different stages.
Printing is a good example of that, a way to preserve. You know, Julie Meritou, your colleague, told me recently that when she went too far with a painting, she tried to erase her mistakes. And that led her to her, a whole new technique and a new series of paintings. And I'm just wondering, by so-called overcooking, it can lead you to a breakthrough. And wondering if or discoveries. And Dana, has that happened for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's how you have most discoveries are through mistakes, I think, or that you. I guess maybe again with the surprise thing, you know, that you are responding to something that you are not happy with, and so you're keeping going, but you're always having to react to the last decision. So that I feel like there's at a certain point, you know, people always say like the painting will start making itself and all this stuff, but I think mistakes are really important, which is different from overcooking, because I think overcooking is like you're saying, like that where it's cooked at one point, you know, where you're like, okay, this is an acceptable painting, and I'm just going to do this one little thing, and then the next thing you know, it's like covered in gray. You know, like you're like, oh my God, that didn't happen last night, right? Sorry, but I think that you know. Yeah, I think I can't think of anything specific, but I think
like any images now. I mean, paintings that happened.
Yeah, I think it's just cumulative. You know,
a knowledge that you have.
Well, I think earlier I would kind of incorporate the potential for gravity or mistakes. You know, through material, like by throwing it. And stuff like that. So that would, you know, land in different ways or fall off or all these things. So you would have to deal with it, right. You know, and that's something outside of your control. And so I think you kind of learn a lot from that.
Right. Your process develops.
Changes from
right.
that. Yeah.
Julian?
Yeah. I mean, I think that basically the whole thing is a learning process,
right.
And one can learn as much from a mistake as from something that isn't a mistake, whatever that is. I mean, I think, and even in working on some image, if you undo a stroke, you're in a sense correcting a mistake. So I think in a way, a mistake is, I mean, in life, in science, half the technology comes from mistakes in a scientific experiment, that somebody discovered something they weren't looking for.
Exactly.
Just sort of happened. And I think that the process of working on a painting between the artist, the mind working it, and the thing, and the painting, whatever it is that they're doing, is a similar dynamic, that you're engaged in some process where hopefully the process itself produces some answers, and where the process, in a way, where the final state is a consequence of this process, and so I don't even know that a mistake is necessarily a mistake. I mean, you either end up with something that is a failure or something that is pleasing to the maker.
Right. And you have to keep taking the risk.
Well, you're stuck with yourself. If you could change yourself, that would be my solution. But
well, that's quite
awkward. I think that also the worst state is like where you want to preserve something because it's so close, and you can kind of feel it, like your body gets really tense, and you're like, oh, I'm doing it, and that only leads to like, or I've just, in my experience, it's just always led to really it just getting worse and worse and worse, like trying to like cover up a blemish or something, and the next thing you know, it's, so I feel like it's you just have to like catch yourself or something and be like, okay, no, and accept that this isn't quite right, and that's so whatever I do it's not going to make it. It's not going to right. Even if it gets worse, it's never going to be like, oh, it was great before. So
right, it was a lemon. In other words.
Yeah, or it was kind of.
It was kind of a lemon.
Or it could be on the borderline.
You both have taught or continue to teach. Dana at Columbia, Julian at Harvard, maybe both of you at Yale. Do you ever bring this up with your students? The idea of going too far, ruining a ruined work?
Yeah, you can just see it, Do you just sort of say, oh, that one's a little overworked?
I think that if you're a student, that's the reason to be a student is to be able to ruin things without any sense of guilt or failure or incompetence. I think once you're a professional artist, if you make too many mistakes, you begin to doubt your own. Yeah. Right. But so I think for teaching, I don't know that one would. No, I think when I think of it, I don't think of something as being a mistake. I guess you might see something that is, they've lost something. I mean, we talked about that before. For a couple of times, I would encourage or make my students photograph their work all the time, so that they could look at stages, which I have basically never done, but in a way I wish I had done. And I think that's because I think you can learn something from the process. But I think the reason to be in class is not to be concerned about making mistakes. Don't you think?
But do you ever talk about that? That's something to be aware of. That it's going to happen a lot.
I think it's usually just humorous sometimes because I think that's where it kind of rubs up against bad painting because you can see, oh, you really wanted this so bad, Then you're kind of like, oh, it's sort of, and I think they understand it too. I think they know,
but
that
bad painting is something that's not that can be good. I mean,
so sometimes it can be. You can have a painting that's really awkward and that's somehow oddly intimate, and you kind of feel for it in its kind of. In its ugly way or whatever. But I think that, and at that point it stops being totally ugly. You accept it in a different way. But I think that with certain students, it's kind of it happens all the time. And I think that they're going to have like paintings where they tried and it's all crusty, like pea soup colored painting. Yeah.
Well, I think we're discussing this in relation to one particular thing, and I think in a sense any painting that we're thinking of is in the context of a lot of other work that artist has made. So that changes it too. I mean, if early Cézanne, part of what is so interesting about them is what he did later on with the struggle you can see in the work early on, where things came to him with such difficulty. I mean, he never really learned to paint feet, for instance. And in those early paintings, and partly what becomes so moving and so beautiful is the way he struggled to overcome the things he couldn't do. Well, if you're a student, that's interesting. It's not so interesting just to move in the direction of the things that come with great facility and great ease. Right. It's nice to see how people cope with, and often that's very inventive. I mean, I think how an artist deals with what they're not good at can lead to much more invention than just doing what comes very easily to them.
That's well said. Do you think that there's an informative exhibition to happen here, like done on this subject, sort of like a corollary to Unfinished?
I think it's the same subject.
Well, but
is there a
would living
corollary?
Artists
I think it's much easier to accept an unfinished painting than something where it's like overwrought. I think that's like and then I think you couldn't really have an exhibition like that. I mean, I think if you did, it would be, it would be a really bad exhibition. But it would be interesting, like in a more interesting way.
I'm being told that I'm going to start Q&A.
It would be a tough one to go look at.
It would be embarrassing for everyone involved.
One of the reasons why I love abstract art, and I would put Dana in that category despite of that painting, is that in a way it leaves so much room for the mind to freedom for the mind to just wander and have different kinds of thoughts. An unfinished painting amplifies that.
Right,
whereas a very overworked painting, it kind of closes all that down. So
right.
I think that's part of the...
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm being told it's time for the Q&A. However, I've got one last question. Do either of you like to cook? Because it's, you can certainly overcook when you're cooking.
I like cooking, but I'm discouraged from it.
I've sort of quit cooking. I used to cook quite a lot, but I sort of don't anymore.
Yeah.
But that's why I said at the beginning, that's why I question your metaphor, Dodie, because I think if you overcook something, you got it right at one moment.
Exactly, exactly. Well, thank you. It's time to turn to questions. Are there any? Is that Pepe? Pepe? Edmund? Pepe? Edmund.
I can't resist saying that when we drove here this morning across the Kent Bridge, we came across a young woman standing with an easel, painting a very meticulous rendering of the river and the valley. And I felt like stopping the car and saying to her through the window, "There's a seminar on overcooked art at the Kent School in just 15 minutes." But I was wondering if either of your guests or you, Dodie, could comment on that famous documentary of Picasso, painting, at least drawing, a series of rapid sketches for the camera, in which his fertility was so astonishing. The charcoal stick flying in all directions, and these miraculous shapes appeared on the canvas. But in each case, at least to my eye, he couldn't stop because of the fertility of his mind and the enormousness of his energy. Do you agree that that was an example, a documentary example of a great artist struggling with an excess of ideas and an excess of energy? And does it not illustrate the sacred responsibility of an artist to discipline his imagination, or hers?
That's an interesting, a beautiful statement, and one would never have wanted Picasso to stop, or not to have seen any of that. But I'm wondering, Julian, what you would say.
Well, I think everything Eben says is true about Picasso, but still, it's like mechanics. I mean, you wonder what Picasso would have done if the camera hadn't been running. I mean, he was such a showman that some of that was just to show off and show his versatility. I can't imagine he would have been working exactly the same way if it wasn't being filmed. And the thing about Picasso is that he did have that incredible facility, which is a great pleasure, but he could struggle and labor over things for years, months, and sometimes he gets to something that's absolutely terrific, and sometimes you have a sense that he ends up somewhere that's less interesting than it might have been, or than it must have been at previous stages. So
is this true? Well, I don't know. Wasn't it true that Demoiselle Avignon he worked on for so long? Is that true?
Yeah, he worked
and
for
he
ages.
actually kept it in his studio for years, for many, many years, and he actually didn't consider it finished, or I don't know if that's true, but that's what I heard. And it was just there almost as a joke. Like his friends would come over and they would, joke about the people in the painting, and that's your girlfriend, or like it was kind of something that he didn't quite accept as his own painting, and he just sort of kept it. Demoiselle Avignon.
But I mean, he struggled with lots of things. That Gertrude Stein portrait that the Met has, he worked on that for ages, and then he finished it in a morning or something. But it wasn't as though that was his only way of working, was to be very, where everything came with great ease.
But some artists need to put out more, need to work that way, and are so prolific, and others or may hold it back, may be doing it and holding it back, editing it, but Picasso was a performer. He was an early performance artist.
Well, he's a showman. I mean,
Yeah. But that was part of what he was doing. But Pepe?
Julian, I had a question for you. I was thinking as you spoke about my research on Pollock's painting techniques, and we think of him as someone who left a lot of canvas uncovered, and you can see the whole process. But in some pictures, I noticed that he would work the painting until it was thoroughly overcooked and kind of a disaster, and then he would just treat that as a surface and begin a whole new painting on top of it. So I wondered if you ever did anything similar.
Well, I think that's a little bit analogous to what I was trying to say about the one painting it only showed. That at some point, if something gets to a point where you've kind of given up all your ambition and you can't get back to what your original intention or your original notion was, that you're then free to do something that wouldn't have done. And then what's interesting about that is that, contradicting the thought that any good painting is always good at every stage, you have the feeling that the thing that if you end up with something that's really satisfying to you, that it's because of what's there underneath as well, that it wouldn't be the same thing if that thing hadn't been there. So yeah, absolutely, I think that's it. And again, I can't imagine that there's any artist who doesn't. I mean, I think my work might more directly make a analogy to the Pollock thing, but I think any artist would have that experience, I suspect. Any painter would have that experience, I think.
I wondered if a painting or something you were doing, a print, was destroyed by some element. Do you go back and try to do that painting again? If say, I know it's happened in Julian's case, do you try to repaint or don't you? I mean, do you just say that's bad luck and I don't want to revisit that?
That's only happened once, where I tried to remake a painting that I had made when I was younger, when I was in undergrad, and I just couldn't track down the painting, and I thought I would try to remake it, and it didn't work. It didn't have the same feeling to it, because I think it could have only been made at that time, so I don't think I would ever do it again.
One of the things that gives me faith in the process is that I think that's kind of impossible. And I mean, every time I've tried to do it, it doesn't really work. A painting of mine was damaged, an early British painting, and the sort of severely damaged, and the cost to restore it would have been far in excess of the value of the painting. So I offered to remake it because I kind of liked the painting. Oh, I can easily remake this because it was a fairly direct, easy thing. So I just got all the materials in exactly the same stretch, and I decided I was going to make two new ones, one that I would keep and one that the person who I would trade for the damaged painting was. And I made these two paintings, and they were both so much less interesting than the damaged one, even in its damaged state, that to my distress, when the collector came to my studio to pick up one of the two paintings, I said, I don't want either one, I'm just going to stick with the damaged one.
That's wonderful. I'm being told that it's time to wrap up, and thank you, Julian and Dana and all of you for coming.